Excellent. Now, just chat for a moment and tell me where you hope to take this discussion.
Well, the movie is going to be generally on the 1993 switch to MMP and the effect it's had on the country, but specifically we're hoping to get your specific experiences. For example, during the 1987 leaders debate, you were debating David Lange when he promised, to hold a referendum and, some of the...
And he didn't deliver.
Yeah.
I'm just moving, so I've got a little room for my hands here. I wander my hands around a little bit occasionally.
That's a little microphone recorder. It's a backup audio. We hopefully get the audio on the first try. But
all right, so you want to concentrate on the MMP, switch to MMP, but the basic theme and concept that you're bringing together in the movie is what?
I don't know if we have a basic concept yet.
I think the question that we're asking is, has MMP worked 15 years later? Is it functioning the way it should be? And what
15? It can't be 15.
No, it's 14, but by the time the movie...
Is it okay?
Yeah.
God, it's as long as that?
Yeah,
well,
crazy, eh?
Yeah, no,
90.
Next year it would be 15.
All right, I won't dispute that. Now that you tell me and remind me that time has gone through so quickly, but this is fitting into a series of interviews that are based around what central theme. I'm only asking this to try and, as far as I can, to flavour my remarks to fit in with your overall, whatever you're trying to do.
We're sort of assessing MMP, the success or lack thereof, for an American audience.
But there's other things in your video than MMP.
No,
Okay.
it really is focusing on MMP. Yeah.
I think it'll be a long time before you get to New York, in the US rather.
Yeah.
To tell you the truth, that is a good place to start. You've been ambassador to the U.S. and there doesn't seem to be any popular support or even unpopular support for looking at the American electoral system. It's very different from here, where you change your electoral system via referendum.
Two countries, two different histories, two different philosophies. And New Zealand started with a very egalitarian base, has from the beginning, so we led the world with giving women the vote. In other words, we included Maori, we included minorities right from the beginning. If you look at the US, it's quite different. Obviously, blacks were excluded, the indigenous people, women came in later. So we really start from quite different perspectives as to how a democracy works. And it's really that's the underpinning question. What is the best form of democracy? Now, there is no perfect form. I think we should move away from believing there's some perfect form. Whatever you have will have defects that critics can point out. But in New Zealand, for many, many years, a number of elections before we move by the mandate of a referendum of the public to a different system, a proportional system, there had always been upwards of 20% of the voters with a very high participation in the New Zealand electorate at that stage, somewhere over 90% of people voted, who voted for some third party that, because of the structure of first past the post and the winner takes all, they knew could never get representation in Parliament. And we as a society, and certainly there were active advocates of this, had to address the question whether that in fact was democratic, that minority views were always going to be overwhelmed by a majority system, or whether the minority view should have the capacity, if they were a significant minority, to have a voice in the decision-making procedures of the Parliament of New Zealand. And by a relatively small majority, about 53 to 47%, New Zealanders said the minorities should have a better voice. And that's what led us to MMP.
So how would you compare how people felt about the political process under FPP compared to how they feel about the political process today?
Different people are unhappy, different groups are unhappy. I mean, there were people who were obviously very unhappy with the first past the post system that we had, which the United States has, which Britain has, to the current proportional system, which most of Europe and many, many other countries around the world have some form of. So the group that were comfortable with first past the post are uncomfortable or more uncomfortable with a mixed member system that we have now, and vice versa. So I'd go back to my base point. There is no perfect system.
During the 1987 leaders' debate, David Lange promised to hold a referendum on electoral reform. Was this a surprise to you? You were debating him at that time.
Had been in the public arena, in the fringes of the public arena, without being definitive. And Prime Minister Lange at that time gave a definitive statement they would hold the referendum. Of course, subsequently they didn't hold the referendum. And it was out of that platform that my party looked at the issues. The majority of my party would have been opposed to proportional representation, MMP, as we've got in New Zealand now. But they believed that the public should make that decision. And that's a quite important distinction. While they themselves, and that included me, did not believe the change was going to be beneficial, we did believe, however, in a democratic system, the public should make that choice, not the elected parliament.
What did you personally believe at the time was the best reform? I read that you were interested in the establishment of a Senate, correct?
Correct. I believe that there were other means by which we could address the concerns that significant minority viewpoints were overlooked in the old system, and that there should be some pause and review process which I thought you could only incorporate in a form of an elected second chamber, call it whatever. And that MMP, in other words a multi-party parliament, would not necessarily be a reflective one. In other words, once a majority of parties had signed up to create a majority government, they would tend to just go down a straight line path as you might get under the first past the post system. To some extent that's been correct, but one has to say that more recently there's the inventiveness of governments in putting together coalitions for various issues meant that it's certainly not as clear cut as it used to be under first past the post. So we are seeing minority voices, significant minority voices, having a bigger influence. And even if you disagree with that influence, you can't disagree with the principle. They have a right to have a say and be heard.
Okay. Hindsight being 2020, has your view of a mixed member proportional versus first past the post changed over the last 15 years?
Nothing has happened that I didn't say would happen. And this sounds arrogant, but it's not meant to be. I mean, what we ended up with is what I believe we would end up with. No party ever likely to capture a majority support in government by themselves. An opinion poll out today says one party will, but by the time of election, I think that's unlikely. That small parties could be seen to have a greater authority or more power than their support in the community justifies. In other words, those 2 or 3 or 5 or 8 swing votes can be hugely influential in passing or not passing controversial legislation. All of that was totally predictable. The ambition of the advocates of a change to a proportional system, which was that the Parliament in general would be more responsive to the community's views and attitudes, I think has not been proven to work in practice. I think we still have the same sort of disconnect at times there. Well, the public see it as a disconnect anyhow. So nothing has changed other than now that we have a proportional system under MMP, it is highly unlikely we'll ever go back, because I don't think you'll get a majority to go back. So I think we have made a permanent shift.
Let's see. Was there opposition? Was there opposition to electoral reform from big business and other interested parties?
Oh, various groups, and certainly many in the business community were very anxious about what they felt would be the uncertainty of the new system. And certainly when it was being bedded in, there was uncertainty, no question. And that was their major concern. There were other groups who advanced very late in the piece what I thought was quite a legitimate argument that we should establish some significant threshold before you change a fundamental building block of democracy, which is your electoral system, and that wasn't advanced. It was too late to advance when it became an issue. I think that's a legitimate issue. How many people what size percentage should you have before you change? I think these are all legitimate questions. But the business community, I think, in general, would have favoured the status quo.
Now, the 1993 referendum, that was somewhat close. I believe that was 53% for, for the change, but the non-binding referendum in 1992 was not close at all. Did those results take you as a surprise?
No, it's the difference between having sort of a real vote and a non-real vote, as it were. A binding referendum, I think, concentrates the mind very substantially. But I think right through, it depended in the time in the electoral cycle. My government introduced many radical reforms when we were elected, after we were elected in 1990, and a lot of people opposed them. And at that stage, support for a change in the electoral system was very, very high. I think it reached over 70% at one stage, because people saw this as one expression of punishing the government for the initiatives they were taking which they didn't like. As that settled down, as the New Zealand economy responded to those new initiatives, as everybody started to see, in fact, we were doing better, not worse, then we came back to about 50-50 in favour and 50-50 against. So it really depends often where in an electoral cycle a vote is taken. And if we'd have taken it earlier, it would have been overwhelming in favour of MMP. I think if we'd have taken it 12 months later, it probably wouldn't have been passed.
How has campaigning and electioneering changed under MMP?
Not a great deal, in the sense that you have, as we always had, a number of parties out there, two major parties, a number of minor parties campaigning. That was true before we changed the system, except the minor parties then knew they would never get into Parliament, or virtually never. What's perhaps more significant is that the major parties know to form a government they will require the support of one or more minor parties, and I think they are therefore more attentive and listen more carefully to the issues that are of particular importance to the minor parties. If you take the issue of, say, the Green Party, all around the world we know what they're advocating, where they are. I think the major parties now listen more carefully to that, because they may need their support in the Parliament on this or that issue.
Under MMP, it's possible, indeed likely, that cabinet will be made up of different members of different parties, and that, how difficult is that to govern effectively?
Some would say it depends who the Prime Minister is. I mean, clearly it's another dynamic you have to manage within a government, that within any party, any major party, that is really a coalition of interests to start with. And I think that needs to be understood when we're having a discussion like this, that no major party in any country has a totality of views that are identical. In fact, they are a coalition of groups who come together and support a broad philosophy. So within a cabinet room, within an administration, you have that same tension. People come with higher priorities for one issue or another, and that's exacerbated a little bit with a multi-party cabinet, but it's only really on the margins again.
So could you tell us about the post-election process, at least from your experiences?
Well, the post-election process in the first MMP election was '96, was a very drawn-out affair, as the two major parties effectively courted one minor party, New Zealand First, to form the government, and we were successful. That is not uncommon, of course, in more established proportional systems like Europe. I think the government in Belgium is yet to be formed after months and months of negotiations. Now I think that's a negative of a multi-member parliament, a multi-party parliament, because you can have a long interregnum where you can't form a government because the various factions are debating and arguing. But from our perspective, we anticipated long discussions. We did have long discussions. The people became thoroughly bored with them. And in fact, if they had been given the opportunity to vote, they would almost certainly voted to return to the old status quo. But subsequent post-election negotiations have been much speedier, much tidier, quicker, all the rest of it. So I think it just depends on the circumstances of a given election.
when you finally did complete the negotiations with New Zealand First in 1996, were you satisfied with the results?
Oh, absolutely. We wouldn't have, signed up. Well, and those sorts of negotiations, of course, inevitably involve compromise. And inevitably both sides are seeking to improve their position through having to negotiate with the other. So, one shouldn't see every agreement that was entered into as being a reluctant one, because it maybe enables someone to move to a position they couldn't move to before. So, there are many motives that come together, but I thought we had a very workable agreement. It was working very well while I was Prime Minister, and I see no reason why it couldn't continue.
Do you believe that, well, since you were both Prime Minister as a result of first past the post elections and multi-member party election, it gives you a very unique perspective on how government works before and after the change. Do you think that mixed member proportional slowed down the system of government?
To a small degree, yes, because you had to go through another consultative process with your minor party, or parties as the case may be. So that is a delay, and you have to have structures put in place within the close inner circle of the bureaucracy around the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to make sure that those consultations take place. They are meaningful. They have sufficient time given to them to reach a conclusion. So yes, that does slow the process down. Now, many would argue that's good, that the temptation, particularly in the New Zealand system where you have a single house, is to go too fast, not too slow. So that hasn't really been a criticism of the system here in New Zealand.
Well, basically, I'm wondering if it's increased the distinction between the executive and parliament, because the executive is made up of members of parliament in this system.
Yes, it is, and that's an old tension as to whether Parliament is sovereign or the executive is sovereign. Well, demonstrably, Parliament is sovereign because the majority of elected members are in the Parliament, and if they wish to, they collectively can impose every move that the executive recommends. So, without question, in absolute technical terms, Parliament is sovereign. They have the numbers, they have the votes. In practical terms, of course, that a political party that's in government is a majority parliament, might have sufficient numbers within the executive, in fact, to make sure they will always get their way anyhow. So, yeah, it's a moot point, but I think ultimately and correctly, the final sovereign decision rests with the elected members of Parliament.
And do you think MMP has made politicians more accountable to the public?
No. No, I don't. In fact, you could argue the reverse, that they have another way to explain why they didn't carry through a particular policy commitment or something, to say, well, look, in negotiations we couldn't do that, or our minor parties would not agree to this or that particular proposition. So, in a sense, they probably have an opportunity to move further away from their pre-election commitments. So, no, I don't think it's advanced that.
So, how has MMP affected the lives of New Zealanders who don't typically follow politics or current events?
Probably in no significant way if they're not watching it closely. But then they weren't watching it closely before. If, because you have a coalition government which has a particular focus on one or other aspect that's important to you, might say we're doing very well, but not even be aware of it. I mean, the number one topic worldwide is the environment and sustainability and all the rest of it. Our government's now focusing more on that because they have a Green Party of some description within a government, and the answer is almost certainly yes. The contrary argument is that this being a major political issue, all major parties will address it anyhow because they know that the electorate is very focused on it and they are tuned to and sensitive to what the electorate wants. So, it's a case you can argue both ways, but I think the average person out there doesn't closely follow these subtleties, but we should never dismiss the underlying principle of a democracy, which is that the average voter, getting the average amount of information, will make the right decision come the election, because that's the only principle on which democracy rests, that the average person will actually collectively, they'll make the right decision. If we don't accept that as a principle, then of course democracy has no basis.
Almost done. A couple of handwritten ones. So you were ambassador to the U.S. Can you ever see MMP or another system like that working there?
Well, it's no reason why it couldn't. I mean, in technical terms, is there any agitation or groundswell in the United States for a change in system? I didn't see one. I mean, the United States problem, if I might observe, is in fact to get people to participate in the electoral process by voting. I mean, there's this extraordinary disconnect in the United States between the enormous political machines spending unlimited tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, on campaigning, and about the majority of Americans saying, who cares, because they don't vote. Now, that is, I think, the first question that the thinkers in the United States will be trying to address as to how they make the political process more relevant to people so they feel they should vote in it. That may occur or might occur if in fact they said, but minorities will have a say because minorities can vote people into the Congress, then you might see quite a sudden change. I think apathy is normally a reflection of people saying, well, nothing we do makes any difference, so we won't bother. I think you'd have to ask the question if you're in the United States as to whether or not the system leads to that apathy. In fact, if you change the system, whether people would become more energized and want to participate in much higher numbers than at present.
Do you think there are differences other than the people? Do you think there's differences in the political culture at the politicking level between the United States and New Zealand?
Oh, we demonstrably grow out of different systems, and the Westminster system that New Zealand's based on, the House of Commons, the sovereignty of Parliament, the fact that the executive comes out of Parliament is a model, that the fact that the executive has to answer in Parliament personally themselves for their achievement or lack of achievement is a quite distinct model and distinctly different from the United States, where of course you have the president with enormous executive authority. He or she appoints the administration, they don't have to be elected by anybody, and so on, and they're not answerable in a direct sense to the elected Congress. So they are two quite distinctly different systems. Is the underlying principle of democracy, one vote, one value, still there? The answer is yes. You know, the United States struggled with that for a while through some of its earlier, more troublesome periods. But the principle now has to be addressed as to why people are not turning up at the ballot box. I think that's a very important question in any democracy, in fact in every democracy.
Do you see any parallels between the National Party and the U.S. Republican Party?
Only that both are considered to be parties of the centre-right. But it is impossible to compare the centre-right or centre-left of two countries because, again, they might reach entirely different conclusions on various issues. And, I mean, perhaps a classic on a New Zealand sense would be the whole nuclear issue, where the centre-right and the centre-left in New Zealand are opposed to nuclear weapons. That opposition grows stronger, not weaker. That wouldn't be so in the United States, where both sides would support them. So you can't say this invalidates people sort of dividing themselves into two broad groups, but don't try and equate across different country boundaries the same value system to groups that are broadly considered to be on the same side, because they're not.
So finally, 15 years on, do you believe that MMP is working?
MMP is working, no question about it. Are there other systems that would work better? There are some would argue yes. Are we likely to see a change in New Zealand anytime soon? The answer is no.
Helen, did you have any additional questions?
No, thanks.
Was there anything that you wanted to add in particular?
No, I don't think so.
All right, well,
You've covered the field.
Well, thank you. Again, thank you for your time, and we'll clear out of your office in a few minutes.
Yes, now I've just got this form that I'd like to ask you to fill out.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Well, you should have asked me to fill it out before.
I should have.
Yeah.
But you do this every time. You say, then the interview's done, then I'll come and ask him whether he'll give me authority. I've been around before.
Well, it's fairly standard. I trust you'll have no problems with it.
Right. And as part of the
Where does this appear when it does appear?
we don't know yet, but we're thinking film festivals, possibly American PBS. We need to find a distributor
A
first.
$1 US
Yes,
is an extraordinary big sum.
I know it's more the it's more the novelty of it, you know.
Is that right? I don't know that I want $1 US. I mean, that's also.
I can give you a $5 New Zealand
No,
bill.
no, 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 no. I mean, the concept is insulting in its own way. I mean,
I
treat of
didn't-
$1 acknowledged and whose sufficiently is consideration I affirm, I hereby freely and without restraint consent to and give to the producer and its agents or assigns to any authorised producer, blah, 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 blah. I mean, maybe American law is
Yeah.
so convoluted that this makes sense, but.
It is. We've got 50 different states, and this basically has to. Some of them require the dollar, some of them don't.
Do they?
That's my understanding of it. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not even particularly that smart. I was told that that's one of the standard forms that the independent documentarians.
What's the date?
Today's the 28th.
Okay.
I'll give it to the closest charity you find.
Okay. Thanks.
I'll have to let you do the flicky board, Brian.
Okay. Actually, the closest charity we'll find is actually right across on the other side of the door, I believe.
I wouldn't be sure.
You have the. Where is it? Oh, here it is.
Phone number, there are plenty. I'll give you Sandra's. If you do need to phone me, you'll find it easier this way.
Would you like my business card?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
This is for my day job. So
What's your day job?
I'm a new media communication specialist. Basically, I work in the marketing department as a professional blogger.
Professional blogger, one of those people who fill the airways.
Pretty much, yeah.
And what's your theory as a blogger?
My theory as a blogger is that
I mean, what are you blogging in favour of or against?
well, I'm paid for by a company. It's a company blog. So basically, instead of hawking our company's wares like you would a salesman, it's generally more more useful to just talk about the issues in the field that you're in. Our field is networking equipment, so we just talk about networking, and we find out from people's responses to the news what people who are potentially our customers are interested in.
What's moving people in the US?
What's moving people in the U.S.?
Mm.
Right now, the big trends are WAN optimization and virtualization, and a little bit of the green ethos, because the business and the environmental concerns are starting to align with the rising price of energy. WAN optimization means you have less branch offices, less branch data centers, and virtualization means you can do more on less hardware.